A military surgeon wasn't trying to save a soldier's life. He was trying to stop something much worse. The bullet had already done its damage. The shattered bone could be removed. The bleeding could sometimes be controlled. But once the wound began to smell sweet and rotten at the same time, once the skin darkened and the fever climbed, the real battle had only begun. Long before penicillin transformed medicine in the 1940s, infection was the silent executioner of war. Across Roman battlefields, medieval sieges, Napoleonic campaigns, and the American Civil War, countless soldiers survived the fighting only to die days later inside overcrowded hospitals where invisible bacteria spread unchecked. The men treating them had no idea microorganisms even existed. The germ theory of disease would not become widely accepted until the late 19th century. So what did they do instead? They poured wine into open wounds. They packed injuries with honey. They washed flesh with vinegar. Sometimes they covered cuts with moss, animal fat, herbs, or tree resin. Other times they used boiling oil, believing intense pain meant they were destroying poison hidden inside the body. Some of these remedies were almost completely useless. A few actually made infections worse. But remarkably, others contained natural properties that modern science now recognizes as genuinely antibacterial. To the people using them, however, none of this was chemistry. It was survival. Every battlefield became a desperate laboratory where experience mattered more than theory. If a treatment seemed to save even a handful of men, surgeons remembered it. If dozens died after a particular practice, they searched for something, anything, else. Imagine lying on damp ground after a battle. Your uniform is soaked with blood and mud. Flies have already found the wound. Every movement sends splintered bones scraping against torn muscle. Around you, other injured men cry out for water or whisper prayers. The smell of sweat, smoke, blood, and human waste hangs heavily in the air. Hours later, you're carried into a crowded field hospital. The surgeon has no antibiotics, no sterile gloves, no laboratory tests. His shelves hold only simple tools and whatever substances generations before him believed might keep death away. Every decision is a gamble. Some patients will recover despite the treatment. Others will die because of it. And no one yet understands why. Historians and medical researchers studying military medicine, from Roman writings to Civil War surgical records preserved by institutions such as the U.S. National Library of Medicine, have shown that the greatest medical challenge was often not closing the wound itself, but preventing the infection that followed. Many practices were based on observation rather than scientific understanding, creating a fascinating mixture of accidental success and tragic failure. But among all these strange remedies, one sticky golden substance consistently appeared across civilizations. And the reason it kept returning would surprise even modern doctors. The remedy looked almost too simple. A thick layer of golden honey spread carefully across torn flesh. To a modern observer, it might seem like little more than an old folk belief. But for thousands of years, battlefield healers kept returning to honey for one reason. Wounded soldiers treated with it sometimes survived when others did not. The practice stretched back to ancient Egypt, where medical papyri described honey as a dressing for open wounds. Greek physicians, including Hippocrates, recommended it for ulcers and infected injuries. Roman military doctors carried these ideas into army camps, applying honey beneath linen bandages to cuts, spear wounds, and surgical incisions. None of them knew why it occasionally worked. Today, scientists have a much better answer. Honey is naturally hostile to many bacteria. Its high sugar concentration draws water away from microbes through osmosis, making it difficult for them to multiply. It is also mildly acidic, and many varieties slowly release small amounts of hydrogen peroxide when diluted by wound fluids. Modern medical studies, particularly on medical-grade honey such as Manuka honey, have confirmed that these properties can reduce bacterial growth and support healing in certain wounds. Of course, the honey available to ancient soldiers was far from sterile. It often contained pollen, wax, and impurities. It was not a miracle cure. Deep puncture wounds, crushed limbs, or severe contamination could still become fatally infected. But compared with many other treatments of the era, honey sometimes gave the body a fighting chance. It was not alone. Wine became another trusted weapon against infection. Greek and Roman surgeons frequently rinsed wounds with wine before bandaging them. Medieval military physicians continued the practice, believing the liquid could cleanse damaged flesh. They could not measure bacteria, but they noticed that wounds washed with wine often looked healthier than wounds left untouched. Modern science suggests there was some truth hidden inside that observation. Wine contains alcohol and naturally occurring acids, both of which can inhibit certain microorganisms. While nowhere near powerful enough to sterilize a badly contaminated injury, washing dirt and debris away with relatively clean wine was often safer than using stagnant water drawn from polluted streams or crowded camps. Then there was vinegar. Its sharp smell became familiar in military hospitals across Europe. Surgeons soaked cloths in diluted vinegar to clean injuries, and sometimes used it to wash surgical instruments between patients. Again, no one understood microbes. They simply recognized patterns. Vinegar appeared to slow the foul-smelling decay that terrified every battlefield surgeon. Acetic acid, the active component in vinegar, is now known to suppress several harmful bacteria. Even today, diluted acetic acid has limited medical applications against certain difficult wound infections under controlled conditions. The old physicians had stumbled upon another treatment that possessed genuine antimicrobial effects, even if they could never explain them. Not every liquid inspired confidence. Strong distilled spirits eventually found their way into military medicine as well. Whiskey, brandy, and rum were poured into wounds or offered before painful procedures. Popular culture often portrays soldiers biting down on leather, while a bottle of whiskey dulled the agony. The reality was less dramatic. Alcohol provided only modest pain relief when swallowed, and pouring it directly into an open wound caused intense burning. Its disinfecting ability also depended on concentration. Most battlefield spirits were far weaker than the alcohol solutions used in modern medicine, making them far less effective than many people imagine. Yet every bottle represented hope. Hope that the wound would stay clean. Hope that tomorrow's fever would not come. Hope that the strange smell of decay would never appear. But while wine, honey, and vinegar occasionally helped, soldiers were also willing to cover their wounds with far stranger substances. Some came from forests, others came from animals, and a few may have been more dangerous than the injury itself. Not every remedy came from a physician's shelf. Many came from the ground beneath a soldier's feet. On battlefields where supplies ran out and surgeons were overwhelmed, men reached for whatever nature offered. Moss, leaves, tree resin, animal fat, clay, even spider webs found their way into open wounds. Some of these materials had been passed down through generations of folk medicine. Others were born from pure desperation. The problem was that desperation rarely distinguished between a useful treatment and a deadly one. One of the most widespread battlefield dressings was moss. Long before manufactured bandages existed, soft sphagnum moss was gathered from wetlands and packed against bleeding injuries. It could absorb remarkable amounts of fluid, far more than ordinary cloth, and remained surprisingly soft, even when soaked with blood. During the First World War, shortages of cotton led Britain, Germany, and other nations to collect enormous quantities of sphagnum moss for military hospitals. Modern research has revealed that this choice was not entirely accidental. Sphagnum moss is naturally acidic, creating conditions that discourage the growth of some bacteria. While it was never a substitute for true antiseptic treatment, its absorbent qualities helped keep wounds drier than many available fabrics, reducing one factor that encouraged infection. But the same battlefield might offer another remedy with far more dangerous consequences. Animal fat was commonly spread over wounds to keep them from drying out. Goose fat, pig lard, or rendered tallow were mixed with herbs and applied beneath cloth bandages. Some healers believed the grease protected damaged flesh from the air. Others thought it helped restore the body's natural balance. Instead, these thick layers often trapped dirt, fragments of clothing, and bacteria inside the wound. Without cleaning the injury first, sealing it beneath fat created an ideal environment for infection to spread deeper into crushed muscle and broken bone. Tree resins presented a more complicated story. Pine resin, frankincense, and myrrh had been valued for centuries. Their sticky texture formed a protective barrier over cuts, while certain plant compounds possess mild antimicrobial properties that scientists still study today. Ancient medical texts from Greece and Rome mention resin-based salves for soldiers, and similar preparations appeared throughout medieval Europe. Again, experience had uncovered a small piece of scientific truth without understanding the reason. Then there were the remedies that seem almost unbelievable. Spider webs were pressed onto bleeding wounds because their fine fibers could help form a physical barrier. Some traditional healers noticed they slowed bleeding in minor injuries. Recent laboratory studies suggest certain natural compounds associated with spider silk may have limited antimicrobial activity, but battlefield webs were hardly sterile. Dust, insects, and countless microorganisms often came with them. Mud and clay were even riskier. Some cultures believed particular soils could draw poison from the body. Certain mineral-rich clays do show antibacterial properties under laboratory conditions, and researchers continue investigating why. But a soldier scooping ordinary battlefield mud into a fresh wound was far more likely to introduce dangerous bacteria than remove them. Every handful of earth carried invisible threats: tetanus spores, soil bacteria, organic waste, none of which anyone could see. The cruel irony was that two soldiers could receive nearly identical injuries, treated with the same remedy, yet experience completely different outcomes. One recovered. The other developed raging fever, swollen tissue, and the unmistakable odor of gangrene. To the surgeons, it looked almost random. Without microscopes or an understanding of infection, they blamed bad air, unlucky constitutions, or even divine will. The true enemy remained invisible. That invisible enemy would become especially devastating during the American Civil War, where thousands of wounded men entered crowded hospitals, believing the worst was behind them. They had no idea that the most dangerous days were still to come. For many Civil War soldiers, surviving the battlefield was only the beginning. The wagon ride to the field hospital could take hours. Every jolt drove broken bone deeper into torn muscle. Dirt, scraps of wool uniform, fragments of leather, and pieces of shattered equipment had already been forced into the wound. By the time the patient reached a surgeon, infection had often begun its silent work. The hospital itself offered little protection. Rows of wounded men lay shoulder to shoulder inside crowded tents or converted churches, schools, and barns. Blood-soaked wooden floors, bandages piled up in corners. The air was heavy with sweat, smoke, and the sickly odor of infected flesh. Flies moved freely from one patient to the next, settling on fresh wounds before lifting off again. The surgeons worked with astonishing speed. Contrary to popular myth, many Civil War doctors did wash their instruments and hands. But they washed them because visible dirt interfered with surgery, not because they understood bacteria. Sterilization, as we know it today, was not yet standard practice. The same saw, forceps, or knife might be used repeatedly throughout the day after only a quick rinse in water. No one realized invisible microorganisms remained behind. Medical records from the U.S. Army Medical Department reveal that surgeons constantly battled what they called hospital gangrene, a rapidly spreading infection that turned healthy-looking tissue gray, green, or black. The wound began to ooze foul-smelling fluid. Flesh softened and died. Fever soared. Patients who had seemed stable only a day earlier could suddenly become delirious, their pulse racing as infection spread through the bloodstream. There was little anyone could do. Surgeons tried stronger dressings. They irrigated wounds with vinegar or alcohol. They applied poultices, charcoal, or chemical solutions such as bromine when available. By the later years of the war, some hospitals experimented with disinfectants because experience suggested they reduced the spread of hospital gangrene, even though the exact cause remained unknown. One decision overshadowed all the others: amputation. Today it sounds horrifying, but for many soldiers it represented the best chance of survival. A Minié ball, the soft lead bullet widely used during the Civil War, did not simply punch a neat hole through the body. It flattened on impact, crushing bone into dozens of jagged fragments. Those fragments tore muscles, severed blood vessels, and left tissue so badly damaged that infection flourished. Removing the shattered limb before infection became widespread often saved a life. Waiting too long usually did not. Historical studies published by the U.S. National Library of Medicine and the National Museum of Civil War Medicine show that early amputations generally produced better survival rates than delayed operations in cases of catastrophic limb injuries. It was a brutal conclusion, reached not through theory, but through thousands of tragic cases documented during the war. Even anesthesia, which had become increasingly available through ether and chloroform, could not protect patients from what came afterward. A soldier might sleep through the operation only to awaken days later with chills, a burning fever, and a wound that no longer smelled merely of blood, but of decaying tissue. The surgeon had removed the limb. He had stopped the bleeding. He had done everything medical knowledge allowed. And still, the invisible enemy often won. It would take another generation before scientists finally proved that tiny living organisms, not bad air, not foul odors, not fate, were responsible for these deadly infections. That discovery would completely change battlefield medicine, and eventually lead to one accidental breakthrough that transformed wounds from death sentences into injuries doctors could truly fight. The greatest breakthrough in battlefield medicine did not begin with a new surgical instrument. It began with a forgotten laboratory dish. In 1928, Scottish bacteriologist Alexander Fleming noticed that a mold had contaminated one of his bacterial cultures. Instead of ruining the experiment, the mold had done something extraordinary. The bacteria surrounding it had disappeared. That mold, later identified as Penicillin, produced a substance capable of killing many harmful bacteria. At first, the discovery attracted surprisingly little attention. Purifying penicillin into a usable medicine proved enormously difficult. It was not until the early 1940s, through the work of scientists including Howard Florey, Ernst Boris Chain, and their colleagues at the University of Oxford, that penicillin became a practical treatment. Mass production during the Second World War transformed military medicine almost overnight. For the first time in history, doctors possessed a weapon designed specifically to fight the invisible enemy that had haunted soldiers for thousands of years. The difference was astonishing. A wound that might once have progressed to gangrene could often be treated before infection spread throughout the body. Amputations remained necessary for devastating injuries. But countless limbs and lives were now saved because bacteria no longer had free rein once they entered damaged tissue. The statistics reflected this revolution. Military medical records from World War II showed dramatic reductions in deaths from bacterial wound infections compared with earlier conflicts. Antibiotics did not eliminate suffering, but they changed the odds in ways previous generations could scarcely imagine. Looking back, the strange remedies of earlier centuries seem almost unbelievable. Honey, wine, vinegar, tree resin, sphagnum moss, even spider webs. Some were guided by superstition, some were based on careful observation, and a remarkable few contained genuine antibacterial or wound-healing properties that modern science has since confirmed. Researchers continue to study medical-grade honey, specialized plant compounds, and other natural substances, not because they replace antibiotics, but because they may complement modern wound care in specific situations. The history of these treatments reminds us of something important. Medicine rarely advances in a straight line. For centuries, battlefield surgeons stood between life and death, armed with little more than experience, intuition, and whatever materials they could carry into the chaos. They made heartbreaking decisions with incomplete knowledge, often watching patients die from infections they could neither see nor explain. They were not fighting the wrong enemy. They simply did not know what the enemy was. Today, a deep wound is still a medical emergency. It still requires proper cleaning, skilled surgical care when necessary, and antibiotics when a bacterial infection is present. But because of generations of scientific discovery, from the acceptance of germ theory through antiseptic surgery and the development of penicillin, millions of people now survive injuries that would have been almost certainly fatal on the battlefields of the past. That is perhaps the greatest paradox of this story. The soldiers who endured unimaginable pain and the surgeons who struggled with painfully limited knowledge unknowingly laid the foundation for modern trauma medicine. Every failed remedy, every careful observation, and every hard-earned lesson brought medicine one step closer to understanding the true cause of infection. The battlefield was never just a place where wars were fought. It was also one of history's harshest classrooms, and many of the lessons written there, in blood and perseverance, continue to save lives today. If stories like this remind you how extraordinary modern medicine really is, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next forgotten chapter of history. If you found this journey through the history of battlefield medicine fascinating, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know which forgotten medical mystery you'd like to explore next.